countries over the next 24 hours, which is amazing. So thank you so much for joining us for this fireside chat with Elizabeth Broderick. This is the first session from Australia, and so I'm so glad we can kick it off over here with such an exciting topic. My name's Mandi Gunsberger, and I'm an entrepreneur, advisor and director based here in Sydney, Australia. Now, I want to introduce you to the amazing Elizabeth Broderick. Liz has had so many roles and achievements. I'm going to try and summarise them quickly before we get started. But Elizabeth is Australia's longest serving sex discrimination commissioner, and she broke down barriers faced by women and men to promote gender inequality. While in this role, her review into the treatment of women in the Australian Defence Force led to many, many cultural reforms. She was also a key advocate for the Australian Paid Parental Leave Scheme, and she also established the recognised globally Male Champions of Change, enlisting powerful male leaders to tackle workplace gender equality. Elizabeth was appointed to the United Nations in Geneva as a special rapporteur and independent expert on discrimination against women and girls, and she's also been appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia and was named New South Wales Australian of the Year. Oh, that's a mouthful. So welcome, Liz. We're so excited to have you here this morning. And over the next hour, what we're going to be doing is talking to Liz today about her work on gender equality, women in technology, and her roles in the UN at the moment. So what I'd love from all of you out there is this is really meant to be an interactive session, and we want to hear from you. So please, please, please leave your questions in the comments section, and I'll try as much as possible to weave them into our discussion this morning. So it's really exciting to have you with us, and we can't wait for you to share your knowledge and, with all the women in tech out there. And I think with all your achievements listed above, you mentioned to me earlier this week, actually, that you had a computer science degree, which I don't know if a lot of people know about. And you spent much of your early career actually in technology. I remember reading as well that you said you were the only female in a lot of those classes in the early days. So, times have changed. But I really wanted to ask you, what do you see as the biggest challenge for women in technology right now and into the future?
That's a really big question, Mandy, and thanks for inviting me on to this great live stream. I'm loving the experimenting with different technologies and just also that experimental mindset, which is at the heart of technology and innovation, but also people's ability to go with whatever happens. So we're good at improvising, and I'd say women are particularly good at improvising, and women in tech are even better at improvising than others.
Exactly. So you're basically saying let everyone go with whatever happens today online.
Yeah. Exactly. Whatever happens, we'll be fine. But it's in terms of the issues for women in technology. Look, there's so many issues for women generally across the world, and we can talk about the global issues later. It's also understanding that women are not a homogenous group. Women come in all shapes and sizes from a diversity perspective. So women with disability, women from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, women of different sexual orientations and gender identities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So, but depending on where you find yourself, the challenges will be either greater or lesser. So it's really a question of degree. And when I look at women in technology is still across the world such a male-dominated industry. It's really interesting. You talked about the fact that, I had a computer science background. So I started my, academic life doing a Bachelor of Computer Science together with a Bachelor of Law, because it was the first time that the University of New South Wales had offered that as a combination. So even in those days, I was maybe, there were 3 women and about 200 men, I think, doing computer science at that time, or 3 women in computer science and law. So it was very male dominated. The classes used to take place in the School of Engineering, the electrical engineering building. And, I realized early on that if I didn't form some kind of symbiotic relationship with some of the male students there, my chances of passing computer science were probably pretty low, I have to say. So I teamed up with them.
A partner with the women these days. So.
Exactly. So I'd, they'd help with me on writing my Fortran and C++ programs and whatever. I'd help them write, their essays and narratives, and together we kind of managed to end up with a computer science degree. But I think it once showed me, and this is coming back to your question, one of the challenges that women in technology, encounter is the fact that most of the institutions and organisations which will be potential employers for them were invented by men, for men, and are still largely run by men. And what we've done up until now is we've poured in a few women, highly talented women who have amazing credentials, but we've poured in a few women and stirred, and we've expected to create environments where men and women can thrive equally. And we know from all the data that that's absolutely not the case, that unless we have the intentional and active inclusion of women, the system will unintentionally exclude them. And that's what's happened to many women, I think, who have really had a strong desire to lead in technology. It's been a difficult pathway, and so many of them are trailblazers, and I have the greatest admiration for them. So, yeah, so I think, actually being able to develop a strong career in technology is still nowhere as easy for women as it is for men. And that's one of the main challenges.
And I think it's about breaking down those boundaries as well. As you say, we've inserted a few women, but it's about how do we get more, and how do we, once they're in that space, make it an attractive career option for women, and of course women that want to raise families as well, not having to choose these days.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Because when I look at it, when I look at the barriers to women's developing strong careers, whatever industry you're in, but if we take technology, they really come in three areas. The first one, I think, is some of the social norms that exist, not just in Australia, but in our other nations across the world. And the two social norms that are important here are the good mother belief. This is well documented by Sydney University, that if you are born and educated in Australia, you likely believe that good mothers are always with their children. Now, they can be smoking, abusing, drinking. It doesn't really matter if you're with your children, you're a good mother. And we know it's such an illogical belief, but often, we still hold on to that subconsciously. The other belief I think that's problematic is we believe the ideal worker is someone who's available 24/7. And as a result of that, someone with no caring responsibilities and most likely male. So you put those two social norms together, and it's amazing that so many women are, developing strong careers here in Australia. So that's the first category of barriers. The second one, I think, is the culture and the structures and behaviours and practices of organisations. And that's something we can do a lot about. So that's an area where I work strongly in how do we shift culture to be much more inclusive of women. And then the third category of barriers are the lack of social infrastructure that exists in this nation. So the fact that childcare is so expensive, the fact that, we don't have universal access to childcare as there is in many other nations of the world. And in a sense, in Australia, your childcare is your problem. Do you have a family daycare centre near you? Can you access and afford long daycare? Do you have a mother or a grandmother who can help out? So it's a different approach here in Australia than to many other nations. And I think that lack of social infrastructure, the fact that even your travel pass is, a 5-day travel pass, but you may only work 3 days. All those things are another limitation on women being employed. So,
absolutely. Yeah. And I know that you did a lot of work on the paid parental scheme. How did you go about doing that? Because there was really nothing before that came along. And as a mother of 3 children as well, who I've worked my whole career, I mean that made or break us basically.
Yeah, no, I was so fantastic when Australia stepped up on that. Mind you, we were late coming to the party on paid parental leave, and particularly a national scheme. And there had been amazing advocacy for about 30 years prior to it, particularly women, but also men speaking out about it. But I think what shifted was, for the first time, we saw the union movement, which was being led by Sharon Burrow at that time, a really fabulous union leader. The union movement, the employer movement, and Katie Lay had a strong part of that, and Heather Ridout. And also the human rights perspective, which I was the Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the time. We all came together and we said, look, we represent different constituencies, but can we not work together at least to say Australia needs a national paid parental leave scheme? It's an a critical part of enabling all the talent in this country to be accessed and to be harnessed. And yes, we might have different views about how the scheme should be constructed, but one thing we know for sure is that every one of us wants a paid parental leave scheme. So let's go down that approach and see if we can work with government in that regard. And I think that, plus the amazing academics that we had who were able to support the business case for a national paid parental leave scheme, that collaboration and coalition coming together is what led to Australia getting a referral to the Productivity Commission, who then were able to do all the analysis. And I think Australia has, at that time, we had a good scheme. I mean, I have a strong view that the scheme should also recognise men as primary carers to a much greater extent than it currently does. I mean, currently men
Absolutely.
or supporting partners are entitled to 2 weeks dad and partner pay. And most of the countries that are doing this really well say there should be not necessarily an equal entitlement, because it's women who give birth, but a greater entitlement, which should go to men on a use it or lose it basis. So if men don't use it, it doesn't revert back to the woman. It actually is kind of lost into the ether, because that's a way of incentivizing men to take up, to step up and really take paid parental leave right at the beginning.
Absolutely. And let's face it, with women who have careers these days, you need a partner who's equal parenting with you. You really can't be doing the children and succeeding in business all by yourself while your partner's out there working a full-time job, plus the rest of the hours that go with it. So absolutely 100% behind you on that. So I thought what we'd move on to is probably what is on everyone's mind, our whole prior COVID, post-COVID situation at the moment. Where do you see a shift towards women's rights around the world in this post-COVID world that we're living in now?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because prior to COVID, what we were seeing is that we had seen some progress. And if I'm looking globally, where have we seen progress? We've absolutely seen progress in women's education, so young girls' education. So with the Millennium Development Goals, what we saw is the level of young women in school lift all across the world. We saw the levels of maternal mortality decrease significantly. We saw the removal of quite a number of discriminatory laws against women, and more laws which were preventing violence against women. So that had improved. We saw a doubling of the number of women in Parliament, although it's nowhere near comparable, but that was progress. And we're starting to see some female leaders. So all those things were heading in the right direction. Having said that, I would say we had also experienced a major backlash on women's rights across the world. We were seeing that as a result of more authoritarian-leaning governments, the rise of a strongman politician. We saw it also because of a rise of more fundamentalist religions, different religions across the world, and a shift to extremism in some areas. So all those things were counterproductive to women's rights, because women's rights are often seen as progressive Western values rather than universal human rights. And in some countries, there was starting to come quite a strong pushback on what they saw as progressive values. So that was coming into COVID. The trouble now is, and I'm going to give you a number of examples, that what we've seen is the backlash against women's rights has accentuated. Let me give you an example of that. Just over the last, since COVID, if we take one area, which is women's reproductive rights, so women's sexual health and reproductive rights, their right to access abortion and good contraceptive and those types of things, what we're seeing, and just today, 11 states in the US have deemed that abortion is elective surgery, therefore is no longer available as an essential service. So that's been a huge setback on women's reproductive rights. And indeed, we've seen the administration write to the Secretary General, the head of the Secretary General of the UN, the head of the World Health, to say that they want the term women's sexual health and reproductive rights removed from the global pandemic recovery program. So we're seeing a pushback in that regard. We're seeing, so that's one area. We're seeing, because of COVID, a huge rise in the care burden on women, with many young people out of school. So all that progress we made about women getting into school, young girls into school, but it's now so many kids are out of school. They're out of childcare. You've got increased elder care responsibility because older people are more vulnerable to COVID, and the disproportionate amount of that work plus unpaid domestic work, particularly in families which are in lockdown or quarantine, is falling disproportionately on women. So the care burden is increasing, and that's at a time when many women are trying to work from home as well. So that's been really problematic. And interesting just even to see in my own team here in Australia, you know, a team that's really focused on gender equality, that in lockdown and quarantine, we kind of fell back into traditional gender roles. And I think the implications of that. So that was the second thing. The third thing I'd say that the pandemic has exacerbated is domestic and family violence. Yeah. And even if I bring it back here to Australia, what we've seen is an uptick, not in the number of women who are ringing the police for assistance, because if you're locked down with an abuser or in quarantine, your ability to pick up the phone and ring the police is very limited. But actually what we've seen is the number of online requests and, you know, reaching out through an online space has gone up at least 25%. That's from my discussions.
Do you think Australia, from what you've seen, is able to help with that at the moment? I know that, you know, quite a few hotels have been turned into safe places, and even for children that normally school is a safe place, they're now at home. Is Australia really kind of taking that on board?
I do believe they are. I mean, it's been wonderful to see the additional funding from the government, because it is the responsibility of government to keep women safe in this nation. That's been one thing. But the other area where I'd say we are probably the most advanced nation in the world, and I see many nations, but where we are the most advanced is on workplace responses to domestic and family violence. So over the last few years, the union movement, the Male Champions Change and others have been working really hard to understand what an appropriate workplace response is, because for the first time they've started to see that what affects employees affects employers, and therefore domestic and family violence is a workplace issue. They have what they call one continuum. No harm at work, no harm at home, and it's all part of one continuum. So there's a strong overlap there. And even more importantly today, because we, the workplace, have taken over your home as part of our workplace. That's essentially, so actually any harm happening in your home is now happening in our workplace as well. So they've really stepped up strongly, and I've seen some fantastic initiatives. Many workplaces are deeming individuals who put their hand up and say, you know, home is the least safe place for me. They're saying, we will deem you an essential worker. We will provide off-site workplaces for you. Some of them are actually renting their own hotel rooms and accommodation for women or those who are being subjected to domestic and family violence, so that they continue to can flee relationships. They're arranging transport. They're actually making sure that this conversation is being had in their town halls with their staff, and from the CEO downwards, I think, which has been really terrific. And the other thing they've been doing in that area is they've been doing men's only Zoom calls to help men talk about tensions that are rising in the family, but also how to share unpaid work and caring responsibilities between men and women. So it's been really good to see those things as leading by example.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And, you know, hopefully around the world that's happening as well, not only here, but good to hear that we're leading that, which is fantastic. So, so I'd love to know, we just covered that a little bit about what sort of role men can play in this changing world. So maybe talk a little bit about the Male Champions of Change, why you established that organisation, you know, and what advice you have around, you know, men taking on, as you were just talking about, part of that and keeping women in the workplace once they're there.
Yeah, so the Male Champions of Change started probably a couple of years after I became Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And, you know, when I came into the role, I just reflected on all the gains that had been made and, you know, realised actually those gains came about through the collective action of women, by and large. And, you know, the fact that I can work and care, the fact that domestic violence is a crime, the fact that I can hold a superannuation account and all those things, that happened because women that I'll probably never know had the courage in previous generations to step up and say, no, that has to change. You know, they really cared enough. And so I reflected on that and just the power that women have had bringing us the rights that we've got today. But I also started to think about what gender equality really is. And it's really about the redistribution of power, whether that's in a family, in an organisation, or indeed across nations. And if we want to redistribute power, we need to engage with those who actually hold the levers of power. And by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, that is men, pretty much in every nation of the world. So if we want to accelerate our progress to gender equality, we need, you know, strong, powerful men, decent men who care about this issue as much as we women do, to step up and say, well, we need to do our part. We need to be equally accountable and responsible for change in the nation. And that was really the genesis of the Male Champions of Change, helping men see that if we wanted to progress gender equality, that they had a really strong role in that as well. And I'd love to tell you I did a whole lot of analysis to see, you know, how this was going to work. And no, I didn't. I basically just picked up the phone and I rang 6 powerful men. Amazing. And I made a plea. I said to them, will you use your power and influence, your collective wisdom and voice to step up beside women and create change in this nation? And I still remember the first beautiful man that I spoke to. He was the CEO of IBM, actually, a big technology company there, but quite an advanced one. And he had twins. And I helped him see that his daughter would never have the same opportunities as her twin brother, all because she was born a girl. Yeah. And I think once he really started to understand that, he said, you know, immediately, well, where do I sign up? How can I become involved? And I realized once you get the first man on board and you get a small few one on board, then everyone wants to come. Yeah. It's got a snowball effect and people want to come in. But I still remember the first meeting we had. You know, people came from far and wide. It was a small meeting, maybe only 6 or 8. But we decided that the time for talking was over. We were about strong action. We didn't know what that looked like, but we knew that something had to shift. And
you can work that out later.
We figured we'd work it out later. And actually the first few sessions were a bit like running group therapy. It was like, oh, I've tried this and that and just nothing's working. Yeah. But we came out of that kind of misery and group therapy stage, and at that time our resolve had really hardened. And where we are today now is we have 17 groups. Got a group in Pakistan and the Philippines, and now a global technology group based out of New York and London, and maybe we could talk about that later. But what we decided was that we would work with the power of a collective. We decided no one of us will ever be as good as all of us shifting together, and that's what we're going to do. And we now have over 250 CEOs of the most iconic companies, the heads of militaries and police forces, the heads of our intelligence agencies and government departments, the 20 most powerful men in sport, the fire and emergency commissioners. So we're across every sector. And it's been such an interesting strategy, and now more of a social movement.
Absolutely. And do you feel like the countries all feed off each other? What's working, what's not working, what your common goal is?
Yeah, absolutely. We all learn from each other. Literally what's happening is we're launching literally hundreds and hundreds of real life experiments, trying to learn. So it's set up very much an experimental mindset. And then what a Male Champion does is launches that experiment together with their organisation, and then offers the experiment up together with all the learnings for everyone else to shamelessly rip off and try in their own environment.
It's learning. It's everyone enjoying.
Exactly. So that's what's been great about it. And also so many women have come into the strategy as well, because it wasn't about excluding women, but it was making sure that the accountability and responsibility for change stayed squarely on the men, because the fact is most women are doing their part. So, but we have many women who are special advisors, so they're to give their advice and their lived experience and everything else. And that's been a really positive shift as well, because we all know the best conversations are had when there's men and women together. So I think it was she was a Nobel Peace Prize winner from Liberia. She said there can be no legitimate conversation without the voices of both men and women. And I couldn't agree more with her. So that's really where we're moving to. And that's been a strong evolution. But, you know, if I could say one thing, we have as a group, as a coalition, been working for several years on what we call all roles flex, so that in most organisations, even from the police to other organisations as well, we change the starting point of work. So flexibility is the starting point. You don't have to ask for a flexible work arrangement. That's a given. The question that you need to work out with your supervisor is, how will flexibility work in this particular role? And I think it was Andy Penn last weekend in an interview that he gave, he said it was that type of initiative that we've been working on for a couple of years that meant they were able to move 25,000 employees from working in an office to working from home over one weekend. And in fact, many of our male champions change organisations said, thank you so much, because actually that's something that is now a business critical issue. So it's been great to hear that.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think that is one thing that COVID has shown everyone. You know, there's flexibility, and now there's this whole other level of flexibility. You know, you used to ask for a day off and it would be like, oh, I don't know if you can. Now it's about whether you ever go back, or whether you work from home or you work from anywhere else in the world. You know, it's really opened up this whole new ballgame for women and men all over the world, which is fantastic. But I thought what we'd chat about now is, your role at the UN. I would love to, you know, hear more about that and maybe explain to people what sort of a unique role that is and what that encompasses.
Yeah, so about 2.5 years ago now, I was appointed an independent expert, which is really a special rapporteur for the United Nations, and particularly their Human Rights Council, which is based in Geneva. And I'm one of 5 independent experts on women's rights across the world. So actually discrimination against women and girls. And I have a number of kind of roles or a number of functions that I carry out in that role. One is we go on country visits. So I've led a number of country visits to different nations to look at the status of women and girls, and then make recommendations to the nation about which discriminatory laws need to be removed, what practices and policies and things that can be put in place to lift the status of women and girls in those particular nations. And just before COVID, a few months before that, I visited Greece, who's coming off the back of the austerity regime and really wanting to once again build a strong economy and really access the talent that women represent, because in the past, Greece has had very low workforce participation rates of women. So, so that's one of the functions. The second function is to write to the heads of nation states from in every region of the world, drawing to their attention human rights violations that are happening in their country. And just to give you one example of that, you know, to write to nations, and I won't specifically name the nations, but in much of Southeast Asia as a region, women are employed in the informal economy. And just recently there was a group of women who were street vendors. Because of lockdown in their country, they could no longer sell their clothes in the street. So they decided to become digital entrepreneurs and sell their clothes through Facebook, which was fantastic. But so they modeled their clothes and you know, went through that experimentation to try and sell clothes that way. Within a couple of days, the Prime Minister of that nation had come out and said that there were a group of women who were damaging the morality of the nation, and they should be shut down. And indeed, the police went round, took these women from their houses, and they were taken to jail. So that's so these are the particular issues that are coming to my attention every day. And and the obligation is on me to draw that to the attention of the nation state and ask for their response in terms of our inquiries, because most nations have signed the international conventions which guarantee human rights standards. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is to really look at what are the major themes on women's rights across the world and to create truly global thematic reports. And I've just completed one with my other colleagues, which looks at women's rights in the changing world of work, and particularly the impact of digitization, the gig economy and those things. How will that work for women across the world, from those women who are farmers, peasant farmers in different parts of the world, through to those who want to engage in AI, for example? I mean, do these trends, what we call mega trends, are affecting women's employment differently? But it's really having a good look at that. So they're the roles. As of the 1st of June, which is just 3 days away, I will step up as the chair of all the rapporteurs across the world.
Wow, congratulations. That's huge.
Which would be amazing. And no one's ever done it from lockdown in Sydney before, so I'm not quite sure how it's going to work, given that I can't fly anywhere or really.
I'm sure that from what I know about you, you will make it work.
So, I will, and I'm going to innovate big time.
Yeah, that's very exciting, very exciting. So with this specific role and, changing the way the world works with the UN, like, what would you say surprises you most about, what you've seen or what you'd like to have done? You've been through so much over the last, 20, 30 years of your career. What would you say really surprises you?
I suppose one surprise is just the extent of discrimination against women and girls that still exists in 2020. I mean, seriously, it is unbelievable, intolerable, and, deeply distressing. I just want to give you some examples of that. When I was in Greece, I visited the refugee camps on the Greek islands. Now, the last time I went to the Greek islands, I was at university, I was sipping my ouzos on whatever else. And to see just the desperation and the particular issues for women in those camps. I went into Moria camp, which is a big camp on Lesbos. It was built for about 1,500. It had over 15,000 people in it, still coming many a day. And part of that was because Greece has been relatively open, their borders to refugees. They've really stood by their commitments. But just the levels of sexual violence, of young women having no access to education, the traumatization, yes, for everyone in that camp, but particularly the safety issues for women. So, I suppose it's that those things still exist. I mean, women's deprivation of liberty in so many countries in the world, women don't have autonomy. They don't have autonomy over their bodies. That's a starting point, but they also don't have autonomy over whether they can leave the house at particular times, whether they can travel, just the things that maybe in Australia you're sitting in your little bubble and you're taking those for granted, and you're arguing about, whether or not you can get a promotion in the same way that a man can. Now, I don't in any way denigrate from that, because those things are important, and we're all living in our own, our own lives and our own nations. And actually, if every one of us shifted the discrimination that existed in our own nation, then there wouldn't be a need for a role like mine. But I suppose it's the enormity of it that still shocks me, surprises me. And then it's also, how do you hold the enormity of what needs to shift and the human suffering that I bear witness to every day? How do you hold that as someone who needs to be energized and needs to be positive and optimistic about the future? How can I hold on to that hope and optimism?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a tricky thing to, I think, balance out there. Absolutely. So as far as I know, I was reading that when you were at your law firm, for instance, in the early 90s, you started a department, that was all about technology law, even though all the other lawyers in the other departments didn't, really believe that was real law back then. And your whole department you set up was Department of One, which was you. That's what I would do. But then you did it over the next few years, and you ended up having 8 lawyers under you and really started that whole technology law world out there in Australia. And how did you get the support? I suppose a lot of women want to know, so many women out there want to do things, and then you've been this person that's actually gone and done them and just fought the big fight. And how do you go from everyone saying, oh, that's nothing, you can't do that, to just going for it and trying again and building it up, I suppose?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because when I reflect back on my career, at every point it's been about driving change. And I suppose that's about influence, because say in a law firm, and really when I started the legal technology group, I was, I was a junior lawyer, so I didn't have any positional authority or whatever, but I had an idea. And I saw that law was changing and the way it was going to be delivered was changing. And that represented great opportunity as well. So I suppose what I've learned about how to create change, firstly, is change never comes in one giant leap. It's about persistence. It comes in the 1,000 little steps that you take, what I call adding to, adding more, continuing, but always pointing in the right, in a particular direction. And you can race in with what you believe is a deeply compelling agenda for reform, but often no one really cares. And I've learned that actually just to race in with that is not what's going to create the change. What you have to do is recognize what's fantastic about what currently exists, so that people's contribution to what currently exists, and then help them as an extension of that see that the future will be different to the past and that maybe we should shift a bit in this direction. So how do you get people to shift? And it's through the thousands of conversations that you'll have. So it's recognizing their contribution to what exists today. But it's also, I think, when you enter into these conversations about change, and I go into some of the most difficult environments. I've been in war zones, beyond the wire in Afghanistan. I've been into military and police, and environments which are seen to be hard-edge macho environments. And what I've tried to do is firstly, I always assume good intent. Because if I start a conversation with you assuming that you're going to come from a place of bad intent, that won't allow our conversation to go anywhere. And even if you think that gender equality is a load of rubbish, that doesn't mean I necessarily disconnect from you. What I try to do in those conversations, however that's put to me, and sometimes it's put to me in very blunt terms, is I try to get behind why you hold that view. Because I can disagree with your view, but I can never disagree with the influences and the family dynamics and all those things that have shaped you to hold that view. And I'm interested to explore why it is that you hold that view. And I even see it in my own working group, the group of rapporteurs. We have so many different views about things. We're absolutely bonded by a common cause of the equality of women and girls across the world. That's what we care about. But if you take an issue like sex work, for example, there will be a range of views. There is in the feminist movement. There will be some who believe that sex work should be abolished from the face of the earth, what they call abolitionists. And there'd be others like me who would take a view, well, to the extent that sex work exists today, I want to ensure that sex workers have autonomy, that they never experience violence, that their working conditions are good, all those kind of things. So I think when I talk to my colleagues who are abolitionists, I try to understand why do they hold that view, and they hold it often because they're deeply connected to the sacredness of the body. So one I'm particularly thinking about, she's deeply engaged in Indigenous issues. Most Indigenous women believe that your body is sacred, so why would you offer it up for sex work? So once I can understand that, then it allows me to connect and have a different conversation, so that maybe we can actually kind of plot out some common ground, and that common ground is enough as a basis for reform. So moving forward, I think don't assume ill intent. Also, when you offer up your opinion, offer up the vulnerabilities of it, the chinks in it, because you always have some doubt about that. When you offer that up to someone else, they can lock onto that and you can have a different conversation. Just don't put the data, even though you might think it's compelling. You need to connect with people's heads and their hearts as well, and that's about connecting them to the stories of change.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. I'm hoping everyone learned a lot from that. That's really fascinating. You mentioned earlier about the global technology group that you were talking about with MCC. Tell us a bit more about that in London and New York, because we might have quite a few people coming from those countries, so that might be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, so as I said, Male Champions of Change, we've started now in different groups. So each group has a really strong agenda. And we started to understand, as with many people on this live stream would understand, just the difficulties in not just technology companies, but big institutions which have large technology parts of their business as well, that they were still very male dominated. So we brought together a small group of really powerful CEOs. So they're the CEOs of organizations like Condé Nast, like WeTransfer, like Vice Media, like parts of Microsoft, the AI Foundation, the Director General of the BBC, Jacobs, which is a big tech engineering company and whatever. And we brought them together to learn from each other about what strategies would deliver a more gender equal organisation, a more inclusive equal organisation for everyone, and to experiment with each other. So we had our first meeting at Davos at the World Economic Forum, because many of the CEOs were there, and we decided, okay, well, we'll take the meeting to you. And at that point, we decided to kick off and make as a strong commitment the advancement of women in technology within all our businesses, the elimination of everyday sexism, and really to focus as much as we could on shifting the culture to ensure that it would be one that was inclusive, not just of women, but of all people of, diverse backgrounds. So we've been, and not only that, at that stage, we took out a full-page ad in the Financial Times where we committed to this, we signed off and whatever. And it's been a great group. It's been so interesting in this time of COVID, because we've been meeting more regularly through just Google Hangouts or Zoom calls or whatever. Just also understanding that if we don't act intentionally during this period, and that's in terms of layoffs, in terms of flexibility and working from home, in terms of some of the mental health implications, all those types of things. If we don't apply a gender lens across the decisions we're making in this very rapid and accelerated decision-making environment, where we're likely to default to just what we used to do, then we will come out of this pandemic with a much less gender equal organisation, a much less diverse and inclusive organisation. And in terms of organisational resilience and performance and everything else, that's going to leave us worse off in the future than we were in the past. So we've been looking very much at applying a gender lens at all those points. So just for example, most organisations have stood up what they call COVID response teams. Okay, have we got equal numbers of men and women on our COVID response team? They are standing down sometimes, and I'm talking the big aviation companies here in Australia as well, but they're standing down significant numbers of workers. Well, are the stand downs disproportionately impacting on women? And I've had some beautiful conversations with the CEOs over that. Some of the really impressive ones have been looking at what they call dynamic resourcing with intent. So you might take executive assistants as a cohort who are quite feminized in whatever environment you're looking at, but in tech companies as well. So it may be a view, well, everyone's working from home, there's less work for our executive assistants. Now, some might say, okay, well, we'll stand that group down. Others are saying, wait a tick. This is a very feminized group. And actually they have incredible, what we call superpowers. They're incredible at logistics, organizational capability and whatever. Where else can we deploy those skills in our organization? And I've heard some beautiful stories of those, groups of female workers being deployed into other roles, which in previous times it would never have been imagined, but because we're in these times of crisis and whatever, that's been able to happen. So there's been some really innovative thinking, and part of that's been led out of the Global Technology Group. The other thing is we've got the CEO of Net-a-Porter, Yux Net-a-Porter, which is great. And been doing incredible things. They've used both, their great technology capability to develop bracelets essentially for warehousing and distribution. So my bracelet will buzz and vibrate if you come within 2 meters of me. So just as a safety initiative, and a lot of that, they've engaged, fantastic women, creative thinkers and designers around that as well. If you're using Net-a-Porter, your bracelet has to look very fashionable.
Absolutely. I'm sure it's a few $100.
Exactly. So they've been, I'm loving some of the innovation that I'm seeing coming out. And as I said, the other things they've been doing is working with men around the sharing of care and unpaid work, and just opening up through vulnerability of a CEO. So it's been really good.
I think that's fantastic. And I mean, we've never been in a world like this before, let's face it, where men are at home with women and children. And I don't think men realised, what was involved in that daily care of children, let alone just the homeschooling, but just having food there, having laundry done, having the house clean. It's been a really good learning process for men and women to all be around that together, I think.
You're absolutely right. And not only that, some of them have been arranging great coding camps for children, so so that kids can log on. I know Yuke's Net-a-Porter has been doing that as well, but many of Male Champions of Change organisations, recognising the increased load in care when the schools have shut down, have really stepped into that gap. They've employed childcare workers who have been out of work to actually run, and early educators to run some of these things. So it's been great to see the levels of innovation.
Absolutely. And for me, it's been the levels of innovation so quickly. People have just, as you say, overnight or over a weekend, moved 30,000 people from point A to point B. And it's, just the quickness so that no one skipped a beat was just phenomenal to see in many countries all over the world. So
yeah, and it's interesting because what have we learned from that? I think what we've learned is that what stopped us from doing it in the past wasn't any technical capability or whatever. It was habit and inertia. Those are the two things that got in the way of us. And interestingly, I was connected with a beautiful disability rights advocate just yesterday, and he said, how interesting is it that it turns out that what's good for people with disability is good for everyone. And I couldn't agree more. What a great framing, because the fact is they've been advocating for working from home, from flexible work and everything for decades, and it hasn't happened. And now he sees this as an amazing opportunity to actually draw on the skills with people with disability who often aren't coming into the workplace or whatever. I couldn't agree more.
No, really good point. Yeah, it's you'd never think of it in that term, but absolutely. So I think we've got time probably for one more summary question here, but I would say, which might be hard for you to answer, but what do you think has been your greatest accomplishment? Which, I mean, you've probably got 15 come to mind instantly, but what would you say you're really, really proud of?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when I think about it, I mean, I've loved every minute of work that I've been able to do to date, and I still hope I've got quite a few years in me yet. And I just think of, the environments that I've been able to, make a little bit better. But, I believe human rights starts at home. That's really my mantra. And if I look within, one of the things I'm really proud about is, growing 2 young humans. So my 2 children, Tom and Lucy, I've got 1 boy, 1 girl, but really infusing in them a sense of equality, that equality as a really core value. So when I think about it, with my son, to grow a son who believes that the only path is equality. Now, it's still a little bit of work in the program. The rest as
always will be.
Always will be. But I think when I think of what I'm most proud about is the beautiful human beings they've turned into, who have really strong belief about human rights as well, because I just think it's the way we raise our boys as well that will be so critical to the world that we're creating and inhabiting in the future. So I'm proud about that.
And I have to say, on that note, I'm raising 3 girls, and really it makes no difference if I raise 3 amazingly strong women if men aren't being raised, for the next generation to believe that women can do anything. So it absolutely is as much a male, raising your men as raising your women. It's equal.
Yeah, it is incredible. But I love also the fact of male champions. Look, it is an imperfect movement. There's no question about that. And, I could tell you all the things that are not quite working properly, and when men don't actually step up in the way we need them to or want them to or whatever. But I had a beautiful moment a couple of years ago where I was presenting to a graduate law class, and I'm just talking about my work as a reformer and advocate, and the male champions have changed strategy and a few other things. And at the end of my talk, the professor asked, well, is there any comments or questions? And this young woman up the front jumped up and she put her hand up, and I thought, oh my God, she's going to bag me out about this one, didn't do that or whatever. She said, look, I don't really have a question, but I have a comment. And I want you to know that a couple of years ago, my father became one of your male champions of change. Yeah. She said, and everything about my life has changed. He's interested in me and my studies and career. He often asks for my advice. Our Christmas dinners are better. The holidays are more engaged. She said, I can't thank you enough. And I wanted you to know that. Yeah. And I reflected on that, and I said, look, we never invented male champions of change for that reason, but how beautiful that it is a personal journey of transformation for men in terms of their engagement with women.
Absolutely. So, people out there aren't telling you that story, but it's impacted them as well. So,
it's been great. It's been really good.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Women in Tech have been so lucky to have you come on board for the first Australian session we have this morning. I know there's many more coming up, and anyone that's missed this, it's recorded, so can watch it later. But just wanted to thank you for your time and all your knowledge. I picked up so many nuggets, I'm sure everyone else has as well. And even just the fact of looking at what's happening in the world, like the way, people with disabilities have been looking at it for years, is such a small thing to be said, but can be such a big change in the future.
Thanks very much, Mandi. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, lots of fun.
Okay, thanks so much. Bye.
See you. Bye.